There's something like this. Almost every generation has been misunderstood by the one before it. In the past, young people were called dreamy, impulsive, unrealistic. And now, it's Gen Z's turn. This video isn't here to defend Gen Z, and it's not here to blame older generations either. It's simply an invitation to slow down for a moment and try to understand Gen Z from a different perspective. There's a very familiar comment that Gen Z is lazy, not persistent, and quick to give up. But maybe that's not laziness. Maybe it's a refusal to burn out. Gen Z grew up watching the generations before them work day and night, sacrifice their youth, only to end up exhausted and slowly losing their dreams. So Gen Z stopped asking, "How much more can I endure?" and started asking, "If I work this hard and still lose myself, what am I working for?" Gen Z still works, but they want work to have meaning, and they don't want to trade away their entire mental health for it. Gen Z is often labeled as weak, anxious, too sensitive, but maybe they're not weaker at all. They just don't hide their emotions. Older generations were taught that speaking about pain is complaining, and silence is strength. Gen Z grew up differently. They were exposed to the language of psychology. They learned how to name things: anxiety, burnout, depression, trauma, not to exaggerate their pain, but to stop living in confusion and blaming themselves for everything. Gen Z doesn't want to become emotionally numb. They want to understand their feelings before those feelings destroy them from the inside. Many people think Gen Z spends too much time online. But for Gen Z, social media isn't just a place to scroll. It's a place where they get to speak. A place where they meet people who carry similar pain, ask similar questions, and don't tell them they're too sensitive. In a world where real life often demands constant strength, online spaces become one of the few places where vulnerability isn't punished. Gen Z isn't escaping reality. They're searching for a space that feels safe enough to exist. Gen Z is often seen as uncommitted, ungrateful, and ready to leave at any moment. But Gen Z isn't loyal to institutions. They're loyal to their values. If a workplace doesn't respect them, doesn't listen, and slowly drains them, then leaving isn't betrayal. It's self-protection. Gen Z doesn't believe that staying in a harmful environment is a virtue. Gen Z is often described as easily triggered, easily offended. But maybe they simply have clearer boundaries. Things that were once considered normal, hurtful jokes, body comparisons, invisible pressures. Gen Z no longer stays silent about them. Not because they can't handle pain, but because they refuse to ignore their own suffering. Maybe the things that confuse older generations about Gen Z are the very things that keep them from repeating old cycles of harm. Gen Z isn't perfect, but they are trying to live differently. And that is worth listening to. Every generation is shaped by a different fear. Baby boomers feared scarcity and instability, so they learned to sacrifice and endure. Gen X feared dependence, so they chose self-reliance and emotional restraint. Millennials feared falling behind. They carried intense pressure to succeed and began talking about healing, often mixed with guilt. And Gen Z, they fear losing themselves. They don't ask, "How long can I endure?" They ask, "Am I living a life that's true to who I am?" Gen Z doesn't just want to survive. They want to live a life that actually feels meaningful to them. Gen Z in the United States grew up in a world that never really felt stable. Economic crises, violence, social division, and social media. From a very young age, they learned early on that the world isn't as safe as adults once promised. That's why they talk so much about mental health, not because they're weak, but because they don't want to repeat the unresolved trauma of previous generations. They also speak openly about identity, about boundaries, about being themselves, not for attention, but because they don't want to spend their lives playing someone else's role. And when they challenge injustice, when they're labeled as too sensitive or too radical, maybe it's simply because they no longer accept silence as the price of belonging. Gen Z is not a weak generation. They are a generation willing to be honest about their emotions. In a world that easily hardens people, if you're Gen Z, please don't be ashamed of your sensitivity. It means you can still feel pain and still feel love. If you're from an older generation, thank you for listening this far. Sometimes, being understood is already a form of healing. If you're still here, thank you for listening. If you'd like a small quiet moment each day to understand yourself better, please subscribe. I'll see you in the next video.